Well, thank you very much. What I would like to do is now introduce our next presenter, Professor David J. Walters from Purdue University. Dr. Walters received his BS and DVM degrees from Cornell University and his PhD degree from the University of Minnesota. Until 2014, he served as Professor of Comparative Oncology and Associate Director of the Center on Aging and the Life course at Purdue University. Currently, Dr. Walters is Director of the Center of Exceptional Longevity Studies at the Gerald P. Murphy Cancer Foundation. Appointed to the National Academies of Sciences, Keck Futures Initiative Scientific Panel on Extending Human Health Span in 2007, he is nationally recognized for his work on utilizing pet dogs as models of human aging. He is a fellow in the Biology of Aging, Gerontological Society of America. And he also had a Lavelle mic. Dr. Waters is also an expert on the comparative aspects of prostate cancer in men and dogs. His research at the Murphy Center Foundation, which targets the underexploited intersection of the fields of aging and cancer, is aimed at developing personalized interventions that promote successful aging and cancer avoidance. As a teacher, Dr. Walters has contributed significantly to Purdue University's dual title PhD program in gerontology for more than a decade. Do you want me to continue? His course to see and seize opportunities offered interdisciplinary graduate students the opportunity to explore the skills and attitudes that promote self-renewal and peak performance in discovery and educating. In 2005, he was awarded the Great Teacher Award for exemplary interdisciplinary teaching at Purdue. In 2010, his first cross-country scientific expedition to study the oldest living pet dogs in their homes as models of highly successful human aging, the Old Gray Muzzle Tour, was featured in USA Today, AARP Bulletin, and Good Morning America. His TEDx talk, "The Oldest Dogs is Our Greatest Teacher, Get the Words Out of Your Eyes," underscores how language limits the scientific method. I'd like to welcome Dr. Walters, and thank you very much.
No, that's okay, I'm sorry. Everybody's awake now, I guess. I think Brandon gave a lengthy introduction, but he didn't hit you with my title, which is this: Situating Subjectivity within the Science of Performance toward Building a Method-Constituting Self for a Self-Constituting World. Now, this sounds like philosophy, doesn't it? A little bit. And I think we can agree that philosophy is a difficult subject. Can we agree? Are there philosophers in the crowd today? Okay, that's good. We'll return to this slide later, but what I'm interested in is talking about subjectivity because it is the process of meaning making from personal experience. And that's how I will use the word subjectivity today, as the process of meaning making and the generation of your own personal knowledge. Now, why did I become interested in subjectivity, and why should you be interested in subjectivity? I'm going to try to do my best this morning. I'm not sure that I can match Martin's idea that a world without statistics means a life not worth living, but I'm going to do my best. Over a 25-year period of interdisciplinary research and education, I found that the best and the brightest graduate students think that the key to success is to go back to their apartment and read 10 more scientific papers in their discipline, instead of focusing on things that could enhance their performance, such as how they deal with failure, or how they deal with uncertainty or paradox, how they read, how they write. So I created a skills course to try to assist them in this. And so, do you think such a course would be of interest to you? Before anybody leaps at this, I'll tell you what I learned by teaching the course. And that is, it's not skills that we're after. It's attitudes. It's attitudes of performance. And what I've developed now is this idea that what we need to do to reach our peak performance is to develop a dialogic self-awareness. And my dialogic self-awareness consists of 3 components: a perceptual acumen, a conceptual acumen, and the art of framing. And over the last 2 years, I've been working hard to try to figure out what are the attitudes that are swirling above that contribute to this dialogic self-awareness, prepares you. What are the attitudes that are foundational? And I've come up with 4 so far: process, subjectivity, polarity, and languaging. And today, we're going to talk about one of them. So today's goal, then, is to give you a perspective on subjectivity and situate that within the science of performance. So I hope that my talk is going to be accessible to you as non-philosophers, and is going to cross over various domains of performance, whether that would be academic performance, or athletic performance, or business performance. And as an act of kindness, I'll give you the take-home messages up front. First, anyone who is clear about the idea of subjectivity has simply not thought deeply about it. It's an integral part of your meaning making. Number 2, subjectivity is the process by which we discern and make meaning of the objects of our world. And it's an integral part of what we do to make meaning. And so you shouldn't look at it as a deficit or an impurity that you're embarrassed about. It's not a limitation that you need to apologize for. If our goal is going to be situational excellence, I think Scott Foote referred to this as situational awareness yesterday, we need that each situation is going to demand a subject-object acumen. And my talk is going to refer to responsibility. And I ask the question, what is your responsibility? And that hinges on some observations. To live with a full sense of the full situation is an unachievable illusion. And what we respond to as individuals is not the whole situation, but instead our selection from it. So, your responsibility is to reorganize as the impulses of nature that you get from your experience and make them your own circumstances. So again, you shouldn't try to dodge this responsibility. You're going to play an active role. And stay away from listening to rules and the laws of other people and seek out your firsthand experience. You need to follow Dewey's directive, John Dewey's directive, and that is the most important thing we can do is advantageously modify the objects of our experience. Reframe your situations, reframe your circumstances, because this is what's going to provide you with the richest experience, the richest possible experience. So I hope that by embracing this opportunity of subjectivity, you'll see that it's one of the critical attitudes that you need for actively constituting self and actively constituting world. All right, nobody walked out so far, so far so good. So for our discussion today, your starting point of your world looks like this. There is self and there's other. And for our purposes today, I think it's beneficial for us to start with this. Now, other could be The trees you encounter, buildings you encounter, other people you encounter, anything outside of self. But here's what we're possessed with. We have this urge to measure other. That's what scientists do. We want to measure other before we've turned inside and measured and developed our self and our attitudes. And remember, the knowledge that we will generate will come from those attitudes, from that method. And that's misguided. So when it comes to performance then, the challenge is for us to make sense of the world. First we perceive it, then we express it in language, so our situation looks like this. It's self and world, and we're trying to make sense of world. So, it's only a small leap for us to move to this, and this is the relationship between subject and object. And this is the process of meaning making by which each one of us personally try to make sense of the objects in our experience. So essentially, subject is equivalent to self, and object is equivalent to other. And what I'm arguing here is that developing your own stance about this subject-object tension is more than just a philosophical exercise, but it's really a key attitude. So first, we need to look at some of the muddling with language that can stand in our way. We muddle our thinking about subjectivity when we muddle our use of the word subject. So, what do we say to kids at the dinner table, all around the world? How was school today? What's your favorite subject? We don't really mean subject as a conscious self that is trying to make sense of objects in the world, right? We really mean subject matter. That's what we really mean. And why don't we say that? Okay, ask 10 students, what are the traits of a great teacher? And 9 out of 10 will say, a passion for the subject. But you see how this is confusing? Because, again, it's not a passion for the subject. They really are talking about the subject matter. Even distinguished teachers are not precise. This is from Parker Palmer and his The Courage to Teach. When we make the subject the center of our attention, we give it the respect and authority that we normally give only to human beings. And again, he really means subject matter, right? A subject matter centered classroom, not really subject centered. And earlier in this talk, as you recall, we were careless with our language. When we made this simple statement, philosophy is a difficult subject, and what we really meant was, it's a difficult subject matter. Now, there's a second form of muddling, and that is, what does it mean when we say something is subjective? So, for example, when somebody says to you, your stance sure is a subjective one, what does this mean? Is your stance good or bad? Is your stance accurate or inaccurate? Useful or non-useful? Because your stance was a subjective one. And what if that same person instead said to us, I hear your stance, and left out the subjective part? So is this stance more good, more accurate, more useful than the stance that previously referred to as subjective? So I'm making the case today that when it comes to reaching peak performance, subjectivity is our process of meaning making. It's not a negative term. And it's nothing to apologize for. It's our process. And if you're still in love with the impossible process of objective, absolute objectivity, it may be more accurate to think of objectivity not as your method, but as a direction in which our understanding can travel. So it's the process of subjectivity that you need to master to get the most objectivity or objective view of your experiences. Okay, so let's look more closely at subjectivity. Subjectivity can be subdivided into two flavors, metaphysical and epistemic. Metaphysical, this is a hot topic in philosophical circles, and it refers to the idea of what is in reality, right? So in other words, this glass, does this really exist in the real world or just in my mind? In other words, only ideas exist. This is George Berkeley and the philosophical domain of idealism, right? We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about that. Instead, we're going to talk about epistemic subjectivity, because that's the part of subjectivity that I think is really critical to performance, because this is about our way of knowing the world. So, it seems like we're making progress. Now we're not talking about whether or not this glass exists. We're talking about our way of knowing, and that's epistemic subjectivity. And then we immediately come smack up against the knowledge problem. This idea of what can we really know and what can we be certain about. And personally, I don't like to use the word know. Our research group stopped using it. Whenever you say no, it's a stop sign for further inquiry, right? You tell somebody, well, we know such and such. That doesn't open it up for further inquiry. That makes it sound like it's closed. And so you can say we believe or we understand, but we try to avoid this. So personally, what I like to do is steer toward the word judgment. So if we're good in this process of making sense of world, then we will have to make judgments. And part of this idea is influenced by this philosopher, Justice Buechler. Does anybody know his work? He was a philosopher at Columbia in the 1950s. He wrote a book called Nature and Judgment. And if we get this process of subjectivity right, then we're positioned to then exercise our art of judgment. And that's in response to that information we collected from our environment is what we say, what we do, and what we make. In other words, it's how we express what we think of the world, it's our actions, and it's also our creative direction. And I showed you this earlier, my scheme, and I'm completely cool with the art of framing being this art of judgment. It's framing what you will say and what you will do and what you will make. Okay, so I know you just finished breakfast, but I'm hopeful that I've now stimulated in you a hunger to understand epistemic subjectivity. Maybe you didn't know those words before you came here today, but now they're part of your vocabulary. So now it brings up this question. Might one's hunger to understand epistemic subjectivity be best fed if one goes to the head of the class? Because the head of the class, after all, is where the top performers go, right? But I say, not the head of the class, but we should go to the head of the mouse. Now, not this adorable little fellow, not the head of that mouse, but the head of this mouse. And this is the schematic of epistemic subjectivity that I've created and what we will build now in the next 10 minutes. No real mice have been involved in this study. Okay, so let's consider 3 kinds of epistemic subjectivity then, so that we can better understand subjectivity. Here's our starting point. We have a subject and an object. You, the subject, are questioning, what is this thing? What is the object? And for our purposes today, let's say this is our object. So you might ask the questions, what is this animal? Is it really a lion? Is it a hungry lion? Does it have all 4 legs and can run fairly rapidly because you're 20 meters away? So those are the types of questions. So I'm going to call that first subjective act, where you're probing the object, direct subjectivity. Right? You're asking, what is the thing? Now, what's going to determine your answer to those questions? You're probing. It's unlikely that you've met that particular lion before. Your answer is going to be based upon your relation to previous objects or similar objects, right? Based upon your previous experience. Not fact, but based upon your previous experience. Okay, we've completed one subjective act. Now let's look at the second. We're interested, you as the subject are interested not only in the object, what is it, but your relation to that object. And so you ask, what is my relation to this thing, and how does this relation affect my discerning of it? So, what's my distance between me and the lion? What's my experience with other lions? Or do I have an experience with this particular lion? So let's call this second subjective act relational subjectivity. In other words, that's probing your relation between you and the object. Now, we can't be done yet because we need a third subjective act, because the world doesn't come at us as single objects, right? So we're going to have multiple subject-object considerations. And so in this situation, we have 2 objects that are of concern to us. Here's our lion, and let's make this, for example, a tree. So we're 20 meters away from the lion, and what we have to make sense of is the relationship between the lion and the tree that I'm going to try to climb up in so that I'm safe from the lion. So we ask these questions. What's the relationship between the 2 objects in my experience, and what's my relation to that relation? Right? So what's my speed of running versus the distance and the speed of the lion running to the tree? And so we would call this meta-relational subjectivity. The small m refers to the relationship between the 2 objects in your experience, and then capital M, your relation to that relation. So together, the subjective acts look like this. So we have 3 categories of subjective acts: direct subjectivity, relational subjectivity, and meta-relational subjectivity. So, what mistakes do we make that impact the quality of our performance? Well, the first thing we do is we have a tendency to take the object at face value and then rush to include it in our knowledge content, spending too little time considering that it's the relational possibilities that will forge the meaning of the object to us. So, too much time on the thing not enough time on the relations. The second mistake is that we like to interpret objects as things, when in reality, many times they are processes that are ever changing. So we need to have an attitude of interpreting objects as process. So I would give you the example of this, cancer. Is cancer a thing? Really? Cancer snuck into your body like a bacterium or a parasite would? No, cancer is a process. Cancer is a process that has been disturbed. And so if we think of cancer as a process rather than a thing, that could lead to new insights. So we're not going to try to get rid of every cancer cell. We're going to try to restore normalcy to that process. And we're going to expect that each of us in this room are cancering. It's part of us. It's part of our physiology. It's a process. Thirdly, we don't see these acts of ordering as our responsibility. Our sense of the object fools us into thinking that we have grasped the object as whole, not just taken as the parts that the object has presented to us. In other words, we're getting small pieces of what the object really is, but we're fooled into thinking we're seeing the whole deal. And so now, all you need to do is add to this the relationship between you and another subject that are looking and assessing these two objects. And you have the mouse's head. We built the mouse's head, and it leads us to this idea of intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity simply refers to the congruence, the agreement between the subjective assessment by two different subjects. And that's an important relationship. So, let's conclude our mouse head building project by saying our performance hinges on meta-relational subjectivity. It's really deciphering, assessing with the best possible method what these relations are, and that's rooted in subjective assessments. And this head of the mouse is the engine generating the relational possibilities in your world and your performance. It's how you're going to frame your circumstances. You'll note that there's a strong emphasis on relations, and that's justifiable because the best definition of meaning that I've come across is John Dewey's, and that is meaning as relational possibilities. So the meaning of this conference is not confined to today. It has a futuristic component, the possibilities, and it's not isolated as an event. It's the relational possibilities between this and your other experiences. Okay, so why doesn't the process of epistemic subjectivity result in pure chaos? Because we seem to be far away from knowing and being certain, and maybe that's bothersome. Well, it turns out that culture, social organizations, scientific disciplines exist because we can achieve a sufficient degree of intersubjectivity. We use similar enough methods, we reach similar enough subjective conclusions that there's sufficient agreement. Without this, there would be no such thing as a scientific discipline. 100 experts would look at a data set and conclude 100 different things. There wouldn't be a scientific discipline. So intersubjectivity then is how we make sense of the world and how we do that together. So, just how important is it mastering the head of the mouse? I think mastering these subjective acts, direct, relational, meta-relational subjectivity, is critical because that is perceptual acumen. That's the process by which you get the very best information from each situation. And remember, my dialogic self-awareness, it starts with perceptual acumen. That's where performance starts and how we get the best information. And that's through our selective attention and our personal process. Now, if you don't want to believe me about the importance of perceptual acumen, maybe you'll take it from this guy. This is Leonardo, and what I call Da Vinci's Big Four keys to performance. And maybe you're familiar with these. Master the art of science, master the science of art, see all things as connected, but number one on his list was learn to see what others cannot. Learn to see what others cannot. That's your process of subjectivity. More recently, anybody familiar with this book by Gregory Burns, Iconoclast? He's a neuroscientist at Emory and wrote a book about how do you become the person that can achieve what other people say is not possible. And the first thing out of the chute for Gregory Burns is see things that others cannot see. In fact, he'll go so far as to say, stop listening to the adults, right? Stop listening to the dogma and make your own original first-hand observations. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, okay, how do I get closer to the mastery of epistemic subjectivity? What might be the key attitudes behind it? And then the first valuable lesson comes from this guy, the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Is anybody familiar with Merleau-Ponty's work? Merleau-Ponty asked the question, what is the subject of perception? It's got to be the mind, right? It's the mind of the subject that is perceiving. And Merleau-Ponty would teach us, no, not the mind, but the body is the subject of perception. Whoa, I thought this was quite counterintuitive, but quite interesting. And if you think about it for a minute, it makes perfect sense. So think about a parade. Think about looking at a parade on street level that's coming at you. You might be able to see the first couple rows of individuals in the parade. So you would report the parade as, well, I think there's 18 people or 20 people involved in this parade. That's all you could report. But what if you position your body above street level? Now what would your perception be? Very different, right? Very different. And it's because your body has positioned you to perceive in that manner. 100 years earlier, Emerson said it this way: what is life but the angle of vision? So we need to position ourselves so we can see what others cannot. So I like the idea of Merleau-Ponty's embodied subject. Each of us has a body which embraces and then constitutes the world. So the implications are, it's not just mental processes, it's not just sensory input, it's our movement, our positionings. It's you coming to this meeting with your body enables you to change your perception of what is going on in the world. And I love this imagery by Merleau-Ponty. It is by lending his body to the world that the artist changes the world into paintings. Right? The artist experiences the world through where his body is positioned, and then he expresses that on canvas. It's through his movements. Okay, another key contributor to maximizing your process of subjectivity is language. And exactitude with language, being precise with language, is a way of finding improved order and meaning, and it's worth noting here that exactitude with language is largely ignored in the training programs of scientists and health professionals. And that's a terrible thing, right? If language is foundational to our process of subjectivity, in other words, how we get information from the world. Language limits what we can perceive. Language limits what we can express. Language is never simply a relating of how a discovery was made. It's part of what is discovered, shaping the knowledge content of each experience. I tell my students, look in the tree and see this thing in a tree. As soon as you name it Robin, you won't make any new discoveries about that thing. So your language has fixed it and shot your attention elsewhere to things that are unknown. So it's true, we see with our categories, and so perceptual acumen then could be referred to as mastery of categories. But that's problematic, isn't it? Because our self-knowledge is scripted by someone else's words. We're using someone else's words, not our own. And we're in a unique situation. So I tell my students, you must become a neologistic discoverer. Martin is using neologisms all over the place in his presentation. In other words, use your own new words and also use existing words in new ways to best describe your situation. I'm going to shoot to the conclusion here because Grandin has said that our time is running short. So I'm going to wrap up with some of the payoffs that come from developing this attitude of subjectivity. First, by embracing subjectivity, we recognize the vulnerability of truths, so-called truths, and of our own beliefs, right? The attitude of subjectivity will become for you a powerful anti-dogmatism device, a device that we really need. You will generate the richest collisions, the largest present, the best performance with you and your experiences. Your focus will no longer be on how many experiences, but really the quality of your collisions with world, because they will be so potentially rich, because you're actively making world. You'll be motivated to develop your own precious method, and with this method, you'll come to realize that each piece of the world that you encounter, each piece that you are asked to respond to, already contains your response to it. The only piece of the world you can get is already filtered through you. So you'll dispel this notion of naive perception, and in exchange for Merleau-Ponty's nice idea that perception already stylizes. Each perception you make is already stylized to your own method. So you'll come to see the attitude of subjectivity as one of your most important tools. And one of the things, by embracing subjectivity, we open the door to introspection, so we will attend to our mental tools. In other words, we'll make sure that they are tip-top, and we'll see in them limitations. So a deeper understanding of epistemic subjectivity gives you a heightened sense of responsibility. And I think that's an important aspect. You need to take responsibility for making world and making meaning. And it's your responsibility to optimize your response to circumstances. And maybe you didn't note that the words responsibility and response have the same root. Did you ever think that responsibility and response relate to the same idea? Emerson said this, build therefore your own world, and you'll come to see that you're engaged in a process of iterative subjective acts, one subjective act after the next, and that leads to the most objective so-called knowledge. But you will be aware that there's no privileged view, just personalized knowledge, and that's because we have privileged access to our thoughts, but no privileged access to the objects of nature. So you'll be equipped with this critical linkage that maybe is a little bit unexpected between body, language, and the process of subjectivity. And so through body and movement, then we can become imagino-analytical explorers. That's where you are today here at this meeting. And through language precision and exactitude with language, we can become eloquent descriptors of self and world. And so you will begin to see objectivity not as your process, but the direction in which your understanding can move. It's subjectivity that is the process you need to master. That enables to perform your dual roles, and that's object in the world and subject for the world. So if I've been successful here, the answer to this question is a big yes. Shouldn't we be training scientists and high school kids in subjectivity? If you look at high school science education books, it's objectivity that we must train people in. Ultimately, the deepened awareness is we're going to take deeper responsibility for constituting self and constituting world, all through the attitude of subjectivity, which is mastering the head of the mass. And I'll stop there.